The Corven Empire had spent approximately 3,000 years perfecting the art of the hunt. Not the messy, barbaric kind involving actual survival or, heaven forbid, eating what you killed. No, the grand pursuit was a civilized affair, a pageant of technological superiority where the galaxy's elite tracked exotic creatures across carefully selected worlds, tagged them with quantum markers, and returned to their climate-controlled vessels for celebratory nutrition cubes. The cubes came in 17 approved flavors, each scientifically optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum actual taste. This was progress. This was civilization. This was how advanced species demonstrated their superiority over the food chain without actually participating in anything as crude as that chain's existence. The forest moon of Vendris IV represented the pinnacle of hunting destinations. Its bioluminescent canopies stretched for thousands of kilometers, hosting creatures that defied conventional taxonomy and occasionally physics itself. The hunting parties that could afford the permit fees, usually measured in planetary GDPs, descended upon Vendris IV each standard cycle with enough equipment to colonize a small star system. They brought sensor arrays that could track a neutrino through a black hole, weapons that could theoretically vaporize a continent but were set to gentle stun, and enough compressed ration cubes to sustain a crew through a month-long expedition without anyone having to acknowledge where food actually came from. Captain Vrel of the Corven Deep Watch had organized this particular expedition with the kind of meticulous planning usually reserved for military campaigns or wedding seating arrangements. His hunting party consisted of himself, two fellow Corvans whose cranial ridges suggested both breeding and disposable income, a thoracic tracker whose crystalline sensory organs could detect temperature variations from orbit, and navigator Quillen, whose species had mastered interstellar travel before most galaxies had finished forming. They also had Marcus Webb, the human, but nobody was quite sure why he was there, except that the expedition broker had insisted that Vendris IV required a local specialist, and the human had been loitering in the orbital station's cantina looking generally unemployed. The human concerned Vrel, not in a dangerous way. Humans were known to be fragile things, prone to requiring specific atmospheric mixtures and complaining about temperature variations that most species wouldn't notice. No, the human concerned him because Marcus Webb seemed fundamentally unbothered by anything. When Vrel had outlined the expedition parameters, the human had nodded. When Vrel had explained the danger of the Vendris apex predators, the human had shrugged. When Vrel had mentioned the substantial fee, the human had quoted a number that was either refreshingly reasonable or suspiciously low, depending on one's perspective. Now, standing in the cargo bay of their expedition vessel with emergency klaxons painting everything in shades of red that didn't help anyone's mood, Vrel was beginning to suspect the human's prices reflected his actual value. "Explain to me again," Vrel said, his translator chip rendering his clicks and harmonics into flat galactic standard, how a military-grade supply container simply decided to catastrophically fail. The ship's AI responded with the kind of apologetic tone that suggested consciousness but avoided legal liability. Micrometeor impact at an unfortunate trajectory intersected with a statistical improbability in the shielding matrix. The resulting cascade failure compromised containment integrity. All ration supplies have been reduced to their component molecules. All of them. Affirmative. Approximately 4,000 compressed nutrition cubes across 17 flavor profiles have been converted to atmospheric carbon. Vrel's second cranial ridge began throbbing, which either indicated stress or an oncoming migraine. With Corvans, the distinction was philosophical. We are 3 days into a 14-day expedition. The nearest supply depot is 11 days away at maximum burn. Acknowledged. Would you like me to calculate survival probabilities? No, I would not. The Thracic tracker, whose name translated roughly to shimmer across the peaks, but who everyone called peaks for efficiency, chimed in with the kind of observation that technically helped but pragmatically didn't. The Quillen can enter reduced metabolic states for extended periods. I can absorb ambient radiation for sustenance. Corvans can manage on minimal caloric intake for approximately 9 standard days before cognitive function deteriorates. And the human? Vrel turned to where Marcus Webb was examining the destroyed supply container with the expression of someone evaluating a mildly interesting geological formation. Marcus looked up. He was wearing clothing that appeared to be constructed from materials that predated interstellar civilization. His facial hair suggested a species that had given up on evolutionary efficiency, and his eyes held the particular glint of someone who found the universe's chaos personally amusing. Yeah, I'll be fine. You'll be fine. Yup. Humans require regular nutritional intake. I reviewed your species specifications before hiring you. Did those specs mention anything about humans and food acquisition? Vrel's translator struggled with whatever Marcus had said, rendering it as something between hunter-gatherer legacy and improvised violence against local fauna. Neither translation improved his mood. You cannot possibly intend to hunt on Vendris 4. The ecosystem is protected. Our permits specifically prohibit. Your permits prohibit hunting the protected species, the ones you're tracking for tags and bragging rights. Marcus gestured vaguely toward the forest visible through the cargo bay's atmospheric shield. Nobody said anything about the other stuff. What other stuff? The things that live here that aren't expensive enough to be on your list. Navigator Quillen, who had been silent through this exchange, spoke with the kind of gravitas that came from a species that had seen civilizations rise and fall like tides. The human proposes to acquire sustenance through direct predation of unprotected fauna. Yeah, Marcus said, I'm gonna hunt something and cook it. The silence that followed contained multitudes. Peaks' crystalline structures refracted light in patterns that suggested deep philosophical confusion. The other Corvans made clicking sounds that the translator wisely didn't attempt to interpret. Vrel felt his third cranial ridge begin to throb in sympathy with the first two. You want, Vrel said slowly, to kill an animal, physically, and then consume its tissue. Well, I'm not gonna eat it raw. What do you think I am, a barbarian? The human disappeared into the forest 3 hours later with nothing but a pack, a knife that looked older than some governments, and the kind of confidence usually reserved for people about to do something profoundly stupid. The hunting party had attempted to dissuade him, then attempted to provide him with proper equipment, then gave up and decided to continue their scheduled pursuit of a Vendris Titan wing. If the human died in the forest, well, that was regrettable but ultimately solved several problems, including the question of how to split rations that no longer existed. The Titan wing hunt went flawlessly. They tracked the creature through 6 kilometers of bioluminescent forest, documented its magnificent wing patterns with high-resolution scans, tagged it with a quantum marker that would impress their friends for decades, and returned to camp feeling accomplished. The Titan wing would continue its life unbothered, they would have proof of their prowess, and civilization marched on. Marcus Webb was sitting by a contraption that looked like it had been assembled by someone who had heard the concept of technology described once through interpretive dance. What, Vrel said, is that? Smoker. Marcus was feeding wood into what appeared to be a metal box with a chimney. Smoke, actual combustion byproducts, the kind associated with pre-industrial societies, drifted upward into the canopy. Had to improvise with scrap from the cargo bay and some local materials, but she'll do. That is a fire. Part of it's a fire, yeah. The other part's where the smoke does the work. Peaks approached the contraption with the kind of caution usually reserved for unstable ordnance. You are applying heat and combustion products to organic matter as a form of preservation and preparation. Got it in one. This is how your species prepared food before discovering chemical synthesis. Still how we prepare food. Chemical synthesis tastes like disappointment and efficiency. Vrel looked around the camp. Hanging from improvised racks were several large carcasses of what appeared to be Vendra's forest dwellers. Not protected species, these were the common herbivores that the expedition guides had dismissed as background fauna. The kind of animals that existed in such numbers that the ecosystem wouldn't notice a few missing. The kind of animals that Vrel was beginning to realize probably tasted significantly better than compressed nutrition cubes. You killed these animals? Yup. Got a couple of those six-legged deer things, something that looked like a boar but with scales, and a bird the size of a shuttle. That one's gonna take a while. And you intend to consume them through combustion-based preparation, technically through smoke-based preparation, but sure. Should be ready in about 6 hours. You folks hungry? The Corvans exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. Quilin's species didn't have facial expressions in the traditional sense, but their bioluminescent patterns suggested deep uncertainty. Peak's crystalline structures were refracting light in ways that definitely indicated stress. We do not, Vrel said carefully, consume unprocessed organic tissue. Your loss. Marcus prodded the fire with a stick. Actual wood, from a tree. The kind of resource management that would have gotten him fined on most civilized worlds. Gonna be delicious though. The next several hours passed in uncomfortable cultural disconnect. The hunting party attempted to maintain normal expedition activities, cataloging flora, running atmospheric samples, updating their social feeds with carefully curated images of themselves looking accomplished against Vendra's 4's scenic backdrops. All the while, Marcus tended his primitive combustion device with the focus of a surgeon or an artist, or possibly someone who had gone slightly feral and decided fire was his new best friend. Then the smell arrived. It crept through the camp like a physical presence, infiltrating respirator filters and overwhelming olfactory senses with the kind of casual power that suggested chemical warfare, but felt like a warm hug from a grandmother you didn't know you had. The Corvan's cranial ridges stopped throbbing and started doing something that was either appreciation or a minor medical emergency. Peak's crystalline structures began refracting light in patterns that looked suspiciously like anticipation. Even Quilin, whose species had evolved past most chemical dependencies millennia ago, oriented toward the source of the aroma with what could only be described as interest. "What is that?" one of the Corvans whispered. "Smell." Marcus looked up from where he was basting something with a mixture that probably violated several health codes. "That's dinner. Wood smoke, herb rub, animal fat rendering into flavor. You know food. Nutrition cubes do not smell." "Yeah, that's the problem with nutrition cubes." Vrel found himself drifting toward the smoker, despite having no intention of doing so. His legs carried him forward like they'd decided on a mutiny and hadn't bothered informing his brain. This is an involuntary biological response. Sure is. Your nose knows what's good, even if your brain's trying to pretend you're above it all. We are above it all. We evolved past the need for complex flavor profiles. Did you, though? Or did you just convince yourself that efficiency was the same as improvement? The question hung in the air alongside the smoke, and neither one was leaving without an answer. By the time Marcus declared the food ready, the hunting party had abandoned all pretense of disinterest. They gathered around as the human began carving meat from the smoked carcasses with the knife that was probably older than their species' space program. He arranged portions on flat pieces of wood that he'd apparently carved into plates, because improvisation was just something humans did when the universe didn't provide proper tableware. "Right," Marcus said, surveying his audience with the satisfaction of someone about to prove a point. "Who's ready for the grand opening of Webb's Wilderness Diner? No reservation required, no dress code, and the only rule is that you can't complain about the napkins." "There are no napkins," Peaks observed. "Exactly, no napkins to complain about. See how that works." He began distributing portions, providing a running commentary that was either helpful or deliberately antagonistic, depending on interpretation. "This here's the deer thing, smoked for 4 hours with wood from those blue trees that smell like vanilla. Got a nice crust on the outside, tender on the inside. Pairs well with these tubers, I found that roast up like potatoes. And this," he held up a portion of the scaled creature, "is what happens when pork and fish have a delicious baby. Little gamey, but that's what the herb rubs for." The Corvans stared at their portions like they'd been handed sophisticated explosives. Peak's sensory organs were working overtime, analyzing the chemical composition, which probably wasn't helping. Quillen approached their serving with the kind of scientific detachment that suggested anthropological study rather than dinner. "It's dead animal tissue," Vrel said, more to himself than anyone else. "Prepared with smoke, heat, spices, and what my grandfather would have called love, but what I'm gonna call spite, toward everyone who said ration cubes were the future. This is barbaric. This is delicious, but you won't know until you try it." The first Corvan to break was named Thren, whose cranial ridges suggested either courage or stupidity. He lifted the wooden plate, examined the meat with all 3 eyes, and then consumed a small portion with the kind of careful deliberation usually reserved for testing alien atmospheres. His expression went through several stages. First, confusion, as his sensory system tried to process what was happening. Then surprise, as the flavors registered in ways his nutrition cube experience hadn't prepared him for. Then something that looked dangerously close to religious awakening, as his brain realized that food could be more than efficient caloric delivery. "This is," Thren began, then paused. His translator chip was struggling. "This is unconscionable. This is inappropriate. This is absolutely magnificent, and I hate that I can't stop eating it." The dam broke. Peaks tried a portion, and their crystalline structures began glowing in patterns that definitely indicated pleasure. The other Corvan consumed his serving in approximately 4 seconds, and then stared at his empty plate with the expression of someone reconsidering their entire civilization. Quillen, after careful analysis, ate with the slow deliberation of someone cataloging every flavor and finding the database insufficient. Vrel was the last holdout. He watched his crew betray millennia of cultural evolution for smoked meat, and his cranial ridges throbbed with the knowledge that he was about to join them. He lifted the wooden plate. He consumed a portion. His world exploded into flavor profiles that nutrition cubes had promised but never delivered. "This is real," he said quietly. "Yeah," Marcus agreed, eating his own portion with the satisfaction of someone who'd made his point. "Turns out, when you actually prepare food instead of compressing it into cubes of sadness, it tastes like something. Why would anyone eat nutrition cubes after experiencing this? Convenience, efficiency, the comforting lie that you've evolved past needing things that make you feel good." Marcus gestured at the forest around them. "But you can't evolve past biology. Your taste buds don't care about your technological advancement. They just want you to stop lying to them about what food's supposed to be." The hunting party ate in silence, each member processing flavors their species had abandoned generations ago in favor of efficient nutrient delivery. Somewhere in the forest, a titan wing called out with a sound like crystal chimes. The bioluminescent canopy pulsed with light that had nothing to do with technology, and a human sat by his primitive smoker, eating meat he'd hunted and prepared himself, looking exactly as unbothered as he had when Vrel first hired him. "You planned this," Vrel said eventually. "Nah, your supply container really did fail. I just knew it wouldn't matter. Because you can hunt. Because I never forgot how to hunt. Your species spent thousands of years getting good at making food boring and calling it progress. Mine spent thousands of years getting good at making food delicious and calling it tradition. We'll need to report this." "Report what? That you ate real food and didn't die? That the primitive humans saved your expedition with nothing but a knife and questionable fire safety? Go ahead. See what happens." What happened was that word spread through the hunting community with the speed of a communications network and the inevitability of gravity. By the time Vrel's expedition returned to orbit, 17 other hunting parties had contacted them requesting the human services. By the end of the week, Marcus Webb had 53 job offers, most of which included clauses specifically about wilderness food preparation and combustion-based cuisine. By the end of the month, every major hunting expedition in the sector was trying to book him, not for his tracking skills or his knowledge of Vendrus 4, but because someone had posted footage of the Corvan hunting party's reactions to smoked meat, and the video had gone viral across 12 star systems. The hunting lodges tried to adapt. They hired chefs, imported smokers, attempted to recreate what the human had done. But it turned out that cooking wasn't just about equipment or technique. It was about growing up in a tradition that never forgot food was supposed to be an experience, not just fuel. It was about grandfathers teaching you how to build fires and grandmothers explaining spice combinations. It was about a species that had colonized the stars but never abandoned the simple pleasure of making something dead taste incredible. Marcus Webb became the most expensive hunting guide in known space. He also became the most requested. Expedition parties that once competed over who could track the rarest creatures now competed over who could book the human who'd turn their hunts into mobile restaurants. The grand pursuit evolved from a test of technological superiority to a test of who could provide the best dining experience in the middle of wilderness that most species had spent millennia trying to civilize. And somewhere on Vendrus 4, a titan wing flew through bioluminescent canopies, quantum tag glowing in patterns that meant prestigious hunting party. Below, in clearings scattered across the forest moon, improvised smokers sent their offerings skyward. The trees didn't care, the forest didn't judge. And civilization, having spent thousands of years trying to transcend its biological needs, discovered that some things were worth remembering even if efficiency demanded otherwise. The nutrition cube manufacturers tried to compete. They introduced new flavor profiles, improved textures, even attempted to simulate smoke characteristics through molecular manipulation. It didn't work. You couldn't fake the experience of watching a human build a fire from scratch and turn local fauna into cuisine through nothing but knowledge, patience, and the kind of casual competence that came from a species that had never stopped knowing where food actually came from. Captain Vrel's expedition logs became required reading at the Corven Hunting Academy. Not for the successful Titan wing tracking, anyone with proper equipment could accomplish that, but for the cultural analysis of what happened when sophisticated civilization encountered a human who refused to pretend that progress meant abandoning everything that made eating worthwhile. The logs included sensor data on the smoked meat's chemical composition, atmospheric analysis of the wood smoke, and a somewhat defensive paragraph about how none of this meant the Corvans were primitive just because they'd enjoyed food that involved actual flavor. Marcus Webb continued working Vendris 4, charging fees that would have funded small colonies and worth every credit. He expanded his operation, training other humans in what he called expedition cuisine, which was really just teaching them that hunting parties would pay premium rates to remember that food could be more than compressed efficiency. The operation became so successful that several human entrepreneurs attempted to franchise the concept, which Marcus shut down by pointing out that you couldn't franchise the knowledge of how to make a fire without burning down a forest, or which local woods made the best smoke. The galaxy adjusted. Hunting expeditions evolved to include time for proper meals. Equipment manifests began listing smokers alongside sensor arrays, and somewhere in the vast catalogue of galactic culture, a footnote emerged about how humanity's greatest contribution to interstellar civilization wasn't their adaptability, their endurance, or their mathematical capabilities. It was their stubborn insistence that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing in a way that made you actually want to experience it, even if that meant spending 6 hours smoking meat in the middle of an expedition that was supposed to be about technological superiority. The Corven Empire continued hosting the Grand Pursuit annually. Participants still tracked magnificent creatures and tagged them with quantum markers and competed for prestige among their peers. But now, at the end of each hunt, they gathered around improvised dining areas, usually set up by humans, occasionally by other species who'd learned the techniques and ate food that required more effort than efficiency demanded. They complained about the smoke getting in their respiratory systems and the primitive nature of combustion cooking, and how ridiculous it was that they'd evolved past such things only to pay premium rates to experience them again. Then they had second helpings and stopped complaining. Because it turned out that civilization wasn't about abandoning everything that made life worth living. It was about having the technology to do anything, and the wisdom to remember that sometimes the old ways persisted not because species were too primitive to move past them, but because they'd figured something out that efficiency alone could never capture. Flavor required time. Excellence required patience. And real food, the kind that made you reconsider your entire cultural evolution, required someone who never forgot that the distance between hunter and dinner wasn't a measure of sophistication, but a reminder of where everything, including progress, actually came from. Marcus Webb sat by his smoker on Vendris 4, watching another hunting party try his food for the first time, and go through the same existential crisis about nutrition cubes that every crew experienced. The human smiled, fed another log into the fire, and thought about how his grandfather would have appreciated the irony. The galaxy had spent thousands of years trying to evolve past its biology, and all it took was one forgotten shipment of ration cubes, and a human with a knife to remind everyone that some things were worth remembering, even if, especially if, they required effort, tradition, and the willingness to admit that maybe, just maybe, calling something primitive didn't make it wrong. The smoke drifted upward through bioluminescent canopies, carrying with it the aroma of progress meeting tradition, and discovering they'd been looking for each other all along. The forest didn't care. The Titan wings didn't notice. But the galaxy, having tasted what it had been missing, would never quite look at nutrition cubes the same way again. And somewhere in the hunting lodges of 17-star systems, expeditions were being planned not around what rare creature they'd track, but around when they could book the human who'd turned wilderness survival into wilderness cuisine, and proved that the most sophisticated thing a civilization could do was remember why simple pleasures existed in the first place.